This is the world's most vulnerable choke point, and for most of 2026, it has remained closed. Oil tankers have remained stranded, and the world economy is losing billions every day. Across the Middle East, governments are spending hundreds of billions of dollars on new railways, pipelines, ports, industrial corridors, and logistics networks designed to do something once thought impossible: reduce the world's dependence on the Strait of Hormuz.
The Strait of Hormuz, the fact that so much of the world's energy, the biggest concentration really, comes from there: oil, gas, and it needs to come out through that strait.
From Saudi Arabia's Landbridge railway to new Gulf rail networks and ambitious international trade corridors, an entirely new map of global commerce is beginning to take shape. But can these megaprojects really replace one of the most important waterways in human history?
There are a number of parties considering contingency plans in case things do get more difficult, in case the Strait of Hormuz is disrupted further.
Stay tuned as we bring you a closer look at the race to bypass the Strait of Hormuz. At its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz is 33 kilometers wide. That's roughly the distance between central London and Heathrow Airport. 2 lanes of shipping traffic, each about 3 kilometers across, moving in opposite directions. And through those lanes flows roughly a fifth of all the oil on Earth. Almost every barrel burned in Japan, South Korea, India, and China comes through here. The entire industrial output of Asia, powered by ships queuing through a gap you could drive across in 20 minutes. It didn't start out this way. For most of history, the Gulf was a backwater, shallow, hot, and strategically irrelevant. However, in the mid-1960s, shipbuilders figured out how to construct tankers so large they could move crude oil across entire oceans for almost nothing per barrel. Suddenly, the Gulf's enormous oil reserves weren't just valuable. They were accessible to anyone, anywhere. Asia was industrializing fast. The Gulf had exactly what Asia needed, and the new supertankers could deliver it cheaply. So the trade routes formed, the refineries got built around them, and the entire industrial infrastructure of the world organized itself around a single narrow channel we know as the Strait of Hormuz. And it was always a risk. Analysts wrote reports about it, and governments commissioned studies as a warning. But the ships kept moving, and the oil kept flowing. The assumption was that no actor would ever be reckless enough to actually close it. However, in February 2026, that assumption broke. Following US and Israeli airstrikes on Iran, the strait effectively shut down. The ships stopped moving, and the global economy went into panic. Nearly 20 million barrels a day, roughly 25% of the world's entire seaborne oil trade, was frozen almost overnight. Energy markets convulsed. Asian manufacturers began rationing. Governments that had never seriously stress-tested their contingency plans discovered in real time exactly how thin those plans were. Some of the stranded ships went the long way, around the bottom of Africa, up the other side. However, the Cape of Good Hope adds nearly 4,000 nautical miles to every voyage, adding about 2 extra weeks at sea. Across the whole global fleet, that detour was costing $40 to $50 million every single week. So what has followed is potentially the most severe energy supply disruption in recorded history, and people are paying for it. Take Americans, for example, who were paying under $3 for a gallon of gas before it happened. However, 6 weeks later, every state is paying over $4. JP Morgan put the total drain on American household budgets at $100 billion. That is roughly what the entire US federal government spends on education annually. All of this exposed a major structural flaw. The world had built its entire energy system around a single point of failure, and almost nothing serious had ever been done about it. The world is finally turning up. Gulf governments have signed off on pipelines, rail corridors, and new ports that will cost around $300 billion to one day rid the world of the Hormuz vulnerability. This is the story of those projects, and we begin with a Saudi escape route built more than 4 decades ago. But the world is only now realizing why it matters. In 1981, with tankers burning in the Persian Gulf and the Iran-Iraq War showing no signs of ending, Saudi Arabia made a decision that they knew would turn out to be a masterstroke one day. With a budget of $2.5 billion, they built a dual-pipe system across the entire width of the Arabian Peninsula, a contingency plan that would give Saudi Arabia a way out. It was 1,200 kilometers of steel running from the Abqaiq oil processing complex in the eastern province, all the way to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. Originally designed to transport less than 2 million barrels per day, it was expanded to 5 million by 1992. Still nowhere near what goes through the strait, but enough to take care of Saudi Arabia's oil exports. Bypassing the Strait of Hormuz entirely, the pipeline runs underground, beyond the reach of any conventional military strike short of a ground invasion. They called it the Petroline, and for the 4 decades, it has been largely underutilized. That's because Saudi Arabia exported the vast majority of its crude through terminals along the Persian Gulf coast, where loading infrastructure was larger, closer to the oil fields, and connected to the primary tanker routes serving Asia. Yanbu handled a fraction of the kingdom's exports, primarily serving European and Mediterranean customers. For years, people wondered why a pipeline that had been built to carry Saudi Arabia's entire export load was running at less than half of its capacity. But it was in September 2019 that the Petroline began proving its worth. Iranian-backed Houthi drones hit the Abqaiq facility and briefly knocked 5.7 million barrels per day offline. It was one of the largest sudden disruptions to global oil supply in history. The attack lasted hours. Aramco invested in converting parallel natural gas liquids lines to carry crude, pushing the emergency ceiling to 7 million barrels per day. And this year, that upgrade has turned out to be one of the most consequential infrastructure decisions of the decade. Yanbu, a modest Red Sea port that had processed fewer than 800,000 barrels daily in February, tripled its throughput in barely a week. Full capacity was achieved on March 11th, with Yanbu's oil exports surging to around 2.5 million barrels per day. The pipeline built for exactly this moment is finally running at exactly the scale it was designed for. Except there is a problem. While the Petroline's pipe can now move 7 million barrels per day, the port's 2 terminals, Yanbu North and Yanbu South, have a nominal combined loading capacity of about 4.5 million barrels per day, which means that the oil is arriving at Yanbu faster than ships could carry it away. This 3 million barrel per day gap between capacity and output is resulting in losses of $300 million per day. Saudi Arabia had spent 4 decades and billions of dollars building a bypass for Hormuz. They had upgraded it after the 2019 drone strikes. They had ramped it to full capacity in 9 days when the crisis hit, and they had still run straight into a bottleneck. The pipeline covers between 80 and 85% of the kingdom's export capacity through a route that does not touch the Strait of Hormuz at any point. That number sounds impressive until you remember that the other 15 to 20%, combined with the port constraints, still leaves a gap measured in hundreds of millions of dollars every single day. By March 17th, Iran was launching 100 drones a day at the eastern province oil infrastructure that Abqaiq and the East-West pipeline depend on. The pipeline runs underground. The oil fields that feed it do not. The bypass that Saudi Arabia built to survive a Hormuz closure was now being targeted at its source. A reminder that in a conflict of this scale, there is no infrastructure that sits entirely out of reach. Investment in Yanbu has continued into 2026, with Aramco and Sinopec announcing plans to expand the Yazref refinery to bring its conversion capacity to 4 million barrels per day by 2030. The port that couldn't keep up with the pipeline is being rebuilt around it. Whether that expansion arrives fast enough to matter in this conflict is a different question. The Petroline was built as a contingency. It became, almost overnight, the single most important energy artery on the planet. And even running at full capacity, it covers less than a third of what normally moves through Hormuz. And while the pipeline carries oil, the crisis has exposed something broader, that the Gulf's entire trade architecture runs through the same bottleneck. When both the Strait and the Red Sea closed simultaneously, that architecture didn't just strain, it broke. This is where another Saudi megaproject offers a glimpse of a more resilient future. The Saudi Landbridge has been in planning since 2004, a 1,500-kilometer rail corridor connecting Jeddah on the Red Sea to Dammam and Jubail on the Arabian Gulf, passing through Riyadh. The logic is that ships arriving from Asia can unload at Dammam, cross the kingdom by rail in under 10 hours, and reload at Jeddah for onward transit to Europe, bypassing Hormuz and the Red Sea simultaneously. It is the only project in the entire Gulf bypass conversation that addresses container shipping rather than just crude oil. In April 2026, the design contract was finally awarded to a Spanish engineering firm. Full completion is targeted for 2034. The problem is that despite 20 years of planning, not a single kilometer of new mainline track has been laid yet. So it is more a mega project for the future, and the math to find a Hormuz substitute still doesn't work, which is why Saudi Arabia isn't the only country that's been building. Of all the countries caught in the Middle East crisis, none has more at stake than the UAE. The numbers tell part of the story. Since the beginning of the war, more than $120 billion have been wiped from the Dubai and Abu Dhabi stock exchanges. The Dubai index is down 16%, and real estate transactions have fallen 37% year-on-year. Dubai's global standing copped a massive hit when Dubai International Airport, the world's busiest hub for international passengers, suspended operations indefinitely after Iranian strikes on the Jebel Ali port area. Emirates and Etihad grounded their fleets. Over 18,000 flights were canceled, and tourism, which contributed nearly $70 billion to the UAE economy in 2025, effectively stopped overnight. However, the numbers don't fully capture what this crisis means for the UAE, because it isn't just an oil state. It spent the last 20 years positioning itself into a global financial hub, a tourism destination, and a trade corridor between East and West. The war didn't just close the strait, it hit every pillar of that strategy simultaneously. And underneath all of it, the oil problem still exists. The UAE pumps around 3 million barrels a day. Before the war, almost all of it left through Hormuz. When the strait closed, the country that had worked hardest to build a modern economy beyond oil found itself exposed and unable to get its energy out. And it was in this backdrop that an infrastructure bet made a decade earlier came to the fore. In March 2008, construction began on a 380-kilometer pipeline running from the Habshan oil fields in the Abu Dhabi interior to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman. Fujairah sits on the other side of the UAE, facing the open ocean beyond the strait, on a coastline that Iran's closure couldn't touch. Designed by Worley Parsons and built by a Chinese firm, it was supposed to cost $3.3 billion and be finished by 2009. However, the global financial crisis caused delays, and the pipeline wasn't fully operational until 2012. It was $1 billion over budget and 3 years late. For many, it was an expensive solution to a problem that kept not materializing. Nobody is questioning it today. Since the start of the war, the pipeline officially called the Abu Dhabi Crude Oil Pipeline has been running at full capacity. It brings 1.5 million barrels of oil a day to Fujairah, loading onto tankers that sail out into the Gulf of Oman, bypassing Hormuz altogether. For the UAE, that pipeline is the difference between partial function and complete paralysis. But despite the gains, ADCOP has always had a problem. It was never big enough to carry everything the UAE produces. At 1.5 million barrels, it covers roughly half of the country's output, and the other half has always had only one way out. That is through the Gulf. The gap between what ADCOP could carry and what the UAE actually needed was always visible, which is why, even before the war started, a second pipeline was already being planned. What the war did was turn a long-term infrastructure project into an emergency. The West-East pipeline had been under construction for months before the strait closed. When it did, Abu Dhabi's Crown Prince directed the builders to treat the project as a national priority, accelerating every phase of construction simultaneously. The pipeline will run a similar route to the original Fujairah pipeline, and when finished, it will carry 4 million barrels per day, more than the entire oil production of the UAE. Combined with ADCOP, the country will have over 5.5 million barrels of daily bypass capacity, enough to move everything it pumps through a route that never touches the strait. As of May 2026, the pipeline is 50% complete, with a targeted operational date of 2027. But getting there requires finishing a major infrastructure project in the middle of an active conflict. Fujairah has already been hit. Iran-linked attacks in April forced temporary halts to oil loadings at the port. Tankers sailing out of Fujairah have been switching off their location trackers to avoid being targeted in transit. The port the UAE is staking its entire energy future on is beyond the strait, but not beyond the reach of the war. What the Fujairah pipeline cannot do is solve the broader problem on its own. The Petroline and ADCOP together carry a combined 6.5 million barrels a day. Even functioning at full capacity, they barely reach half of the oil trade through Hormuz. The rest of the math falls to a country that built its own bypass for $2 billion. But when the moment finally came, it didn't work. The third biggest pipeline to bypass Hormuz is located in Iran, and there is a certain irony in that Iran built it at all. For 40 years, the threat of closing the strait was Iran's most powerful card. Every time tensions rose, every time sanctions tightened, every time Washington moved a carrier group into the Gulf, Tehran would remind the world that it sat beside a choke point, that it could close and paralyze the global economy. The problem with that card was that Iran's own oil exports passed through Hormuz too. Karg Island, which handles around 90% of Iran's crude exports, sits deep inside the Persian Gulf. Closing the strait would cut off every enemy in the region. However, it would simultaneously cut off Iran's primary source of revenue. Closing it would hurt Iran as much as anyone. For decades, that contradiction sat at the heart of Tehran's Hormuz strategy, which is why the threat was always made but never followed through. So in 2019, Iran decided to solve that problem. A $2 billion pipeline, 1,000 kilometers long, running from the Gorey oil terminal in Bushehr province, south along the coast, terminating at a brand new export facility at Jask, a port that sits east of the Strait of Hormuz on the Gulf of Oman, entirely outside the choke point. The logic was straightforward. Once the pipeline was running, Iran could export its oil without ever needing Hormuz. And if Iran didn't need Hormuz, the threat would finally have teeth. President Rouhani inaugurated the project in July 2021, declaring it complete in his final days in office. However, he was warned that the pipeline wasn't complete, and bringing it into service prematurely risked damaging the infrastructure. Rouhani opened it anyway, and the warnings turned out to be accurate. When the ceremony ended and the cameras left, the reality at Jask was considerably less impressive than the announcement. Of the 20 storage tanks the terminal required, only 4 were operational. Of the 3 single-buoy moorings needed to load tankers at sea, only 1 was working. That one buoy was used periodically to load around 300,000 barrels a day onto medium-range tankers, which is less than a third of the pipeline's stated capacity. It was serving short-range routes to the Indian subcontinent rather than the global markets the project was supposed to unlock. Over the years that followed, the loadings were sporadic at best. Between October 2024 and April 2025, satellite tracking picked up nothing at the Jask buoy except oil slicks leaking from the mooring itself. The bypass that Iran had built to make itself immune to a Hormuz closure was leaking crude into the Gulf of Oman while sitting essentially idle. So work continued, and all 20 storage tanks were finally completed in mid-2025. 4 years after the inauguration ceremony, the terminal had reached the basic infrastructure level it was supposed to have on opening day. The pipeline was still running at a fraction of its design capacity, nowhere near the 1 million barrels a day that Rouhani had promised when he cut the ribbon. Then February 2026 arrived and Iran blockaded the strait. The bypass they had spent $2 billion building specifically for this moment was put to the test, and to say it didn't work is an understatement. Iran exports around 1.5 million barrels daily, and the Jask pipeline can handle less than 20% of that. The rest is stranded, and the card Iran has spent $2 billion to make playable is not working. Now, with Karg Island cut off and Jask barely functional, Iran itself is bleeding from the wound it inflicted. The infrastructure we have covered so far is currently making up half of the oil exports stranded due to the war. However, 2 key oil-rich nations in the region are still struggling to find alternates. Iraq pumped 4.3 million barrels a day before the war. By mid-March 2026, that number had collapsed to 1.4 million, with exports near zero. That's because southern Iraq, where the vast majority of the country's oil actually comes from, has no bypass infrastructure at all. The Basra terminals that can handle over 3 million barrels of oil a day sit inside the Gulf, and every barrel of that has historically left through Hormuz. But for months, the country that sits on the world's 5th largest proven oil reserves has nowhere to send them. The country has one northern pipeline, the Kirkuk-Ceyhan line, running 970 kilometers from the Kurdish north of Iraq to the Turkish Mediterranean port of Ceyhan. It has a design capacity of 1.6 million barrels per day, but has been effectively shut down since 2023 after Turkey was found in violation of pipeline agreements. Even when operational, the pipeline carries around 200,000 barrels a day, less than a sixth of its capacity. The longer-term answer Iraq is reaching for is the Basra-Haditha pipeline, a new route connecting its southern oil fields westward through the country, eventually linking to multiple export outlets, including Turkey, Syria, and Jordan. Iraqi Prime Minister al-Sudani approved $1.5 billion for the project in April 2026, with early flows potentially arriving by late 2026 or early 2027. At full capacity, it could carry more than 2 million barrels per day, enough to meaningfully change Iraq's strategic position. But pipeline construction in Iraq, a country that has spent decades managing ethnic divisions, militia politics, and infrastructure sabotage simultaneously, has a history of running behind schedule and over budget. Then there is Kuwait. Kuwait pumped around 2 million barrels a day before the war. Every single barrel left through Hormuz. The country has no pipeline alternative, no bypass infrastructure, and had no plan before February 2026. When the strait closed, Kuwait's oil export industry didn't slow down. It stopped. Kuwait Petroleum Corporation suspended its obligations as circumstances made them impossible to fulfill. By April 20th, that decision was extended, with the corporation stating it could not meet contractual obligations, even if Hormuz reopened. Months of stranded production had filled every storage tank the country had, and the infrastructure needed time to drain before exports could resume at anything close to normal volumes, regardless of what happened in the strait. Of all the Gulf producers, Kuwait's exposure is the starkest because it is the most complete. Saudi Arabia and the UAE had built partial answers. Iran had built a dysfunctional one. Iraq had a broken pipeline it was trying to revive. Kuwait had nothing, and in the months since the crisis began, new proposals are being discussed, including new pipelines to Saudi Arabia and corridors through Iraq. However, past studies have concluded that building any infrastructure across neighboring countries will be too difficult and expensive. In the meantime, Kuwait relies on contractual swap agreements and utilizes the export corridors of its Gulf allies to navigate ongoing blockades. Despite all the efforts to build a parallel pipeline infrastructure from scratch, there's a lingering question. Is it enough? And is an artificial corridor even possible? Because moving oil is only one part of the equation. There's a lot more to be answered yet. Every pipeline in this video moves crude oil, But for all the damage its disruption has caused, there's energy infrastructure beyond oil, and it is arguably posing an even bigger problem. Qatar, the world's second-largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, is completely dependent on the Strait of Hormuz for its export. There is no substitute pipeline for LNG, nor a bypass route. The gas has to be supercooled to minus 162 degrees Celsius, loaded onto specialized tankers, and shipped. And the only way those tankers can reach the open ocean from Qatar is through Hormuz. On March 4th, after drone strikes hit the Ras Laffan complex, Qatar Energy suspended its delivery obligations to buyers across Europe and Asia simultaneously. A second wave of Iranian missile strikes on March 18th and 19th caused significant structural damage to two production trains, knocking out 17% of Qatar's LNG export capacity. Repairs would take between 3 and 5 years. The affected contracts resulted in annual revenue loss of around $20 billion. One energy analyst described the Ras Laffan strikes as an event whose effects would probably eclipse in depth and scope the impact of Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. That comparison is relevant because the Ukraine war reshaped European energy policy, sent gas prices to record highs, and accelerated a continent-wide pivot away from Russian supply. Europe spent 3 years diversifying away from Russian gas and had grown to rely heavily on Qatari LNG, which is why the current disruption can be even more brutal. Liquefied gas prices in Europe and Asia surged 65% in the first weeks of the crisis, reaching their highest levels since 2023. This high-price environment will sustain even if a ceasefire comes quickly, because safely restarting LNG production takes weeks. And unlike oil, there is no workaround. The pipelines being built across the Arabian Peninsula cannot carry LNG. The Cape of Good Hope detour doesn't help Qatar because the gas can't get out of the Gulf in the first place. Qatar has no alternative export route other than tankers through the strait. There are no pipelines. There are no land corridors. There is no Plan B. For Qatar, the closure of Hormuz is not an inconvenience. It is a complete and total export shutdown. The damage hasn't been limited to energy. The food supply has already started breaking. The Persian Gulf accounts for nearly 43% of the world's seaborne urea exports, which is used to grow roughly half the food on Earth. Qatar's Ras Laffan, beyond being the world's biggest LNG facility, is also the world's largest single-site urea producer. When it went dark, both stopped simultaneously. The timing made everything worse. The closure hit during the spring planting window, the narrow period when fertilizer needs to be in the ground if the 2026 harvest is going to be anything close to normal. Farmers who couldn't get fertilizer at any price didn't plant. Harvests that don't happen in 2026 become food shortages in 2027. The impact of the Hormuz closure on global food supply won't be visible on supermarket shelves for another year. From petrochemicals to food to packaging and textile, every industry is breaking down under the pressure of a choked global supply chain. But while strategic reserves exist for oil, the world never built strategic reserves for everything else that moves through Hormuz. So, when all is said and done, where does the world stand when it comes to finding a substitute for the Strait of Hormuz? The IEA estimates that Saudi and Emirati pipelines combined can redirect over 5 million barrels per day outside Hormuz. The strait, before the war, carried 20 million, creating a 15 million barrel shortfall every day. And that's before you account for the fact that Iran has spent the last 3 months deliberately targeting the infrastructure those pipelines depend on. The Petroline was hit by Iranian drones in April, cutting throughput by 700,000 barrels a day. Fujairah was struck. The assumption that a pipeline terminus on the Gulf of Oman was safely outside the conflict zone turned out to be wrong. Iran's strategy has not simply been to close Hormuz and wait. It moved immediately against the ports and terminals that can use substitute pipelines to get oil onto tankers. Iran's attacks on Gulf energy infrastructure have created what Gulf state officials described to CNBC as a huge trust gap that may never be fully repaired. Under the current scenario, the closure puts $3.57 trillion of global GDP at risk, and it can rise up to $7 trillion in case of a prolonged war. No new infrastructure is capable of making up that sort of an economic loss. The bypass infrastructure currently available was sized for a short disruption, while the cost of building infrastructure capable of fully replacing the strait's throughput is economically indefensible. It would require a scale of infrastructure investment the world has never attempted outside wartime. New pipelines from every Gulf producer to every coast, LNG export terminals on the Gulf of Oman, rail corridors across countries that have spent decades in political conflict with each other. That is a fundamental restructuring of how the world sources its energy. A project measured not in years, but in decades. The $290 billion currently being committed across the Gulf is a start. It is not an answer. The strait will eventually reopen. When it does, the world might be staring at a new economic reality where the current laws of trade may no longer be applicable. Which of these megaprojects have the potential to rival Hormuz? Would it ever be possible to solve the Hormuz problem, or will it change the makeup of the global trade entirely? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, check out our video on the biggest megaprojects in the Arab world. Keep following Signum for more interesting stories behind the world's greatest megaprojects.